Today on Stronger Than Reason, we'll dip into Australian post-punk with Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds and their 1994 album, Let Love In. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. And now for something completely different. Let's talk about a band that doesn't have huge beats, that doesn't program their music, that isn't trying to pack a dance floor, that isn't interested in dressing like they just spent the afternoon at the Thunderdome. Let's talk about a band that has a classy style, that wears suits on stage, a band whose power comes from their musicianship, their subject matter, and their leader's unique qualities as a singer and a songwriter. This is a band that isn't really part of a scene. They somewhat transcend genre. In the big evolutionary tree of 20th century music, they clearly descended from punk, but were fairly unrelated to the fads and movements that followed. And I'm not an expert in this band. I can't give you the context of their whole history. I can only speak to my experience with the small amount of material that I know, mostly this particular album I'm going to talk about. If I had to describe their music, I would use words like primal, raw, spiritual, beautiful, cinematic, and I've been listening to a few bands in that realm lately. Yeah, there's more than one. It was just a question of which of these I would tackle first, really. Maybe I'm feeling the end of summer, or maybe it's me just feeling more middle-aged than usual, noticing those aches and pains and realizing that really nothing lasts forever. But I've been looking for music that kind of expresses those feelings, and the album I'm talking about today came out in 1994, and it became a classic really for one song in particular, but the entire thing holds up really well. It's clearly the product of a true artist, someone who's following a vision, who's not catering to the latest music fad or fashion, and as such, this album does not sound dated to me. It could have been recorded yesterday. Again, it transcends genre and any particular time. Normally, when we say something is timeless, we mean that it's a classic. And this is a classic album. It's not this band's most commercially successful album, but it was the one that got the world to really sit up and take notice. This was a band that was doing something different, a band with some gravity, making music with some real heft to it. And of course, I'm talking about Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, and specifically their album, Let Love In. So let's go back to 1994. Why on earth did I buy this album? I mean, Nick's music was very unlike everything else I was listening to at the time. I didn't really have friends who were listening to this, so how did I get into it? Again, I like a lot of different kinds of music that probably doesn't come through in this show since I'm focusing on certain genres, but, you know, if I'm being honest, back in 94, I probably got interested in Nick Cave because I happened to be watching MTV one night, as we used to do. And it wasn't that I saw a Nick Cave video. I was actually watching their reality TV series, The Real World, which is embarrassing to admit, but that was the truth. Remember that show? If I'm not mistaken, The Real World might have been the first actual reality television show. And if that's the case, then I guess we have MTV to thank for foisting that crap on us for the next 3 decades. But I have a distinct memory of a song showing up in one episode where a person, imagine this, was not reciprocating another person's affections. And the song had the words, "Do you love me like I love you?" sung by a guy in a cool baritone. Now, at this point, I was a sophisticated college student, and I had access to the internet, and we didn't have Google, but we did have Usenet, which, you know, for all you kids, was something like an early Reddit. I really hate myself for making that comparison, but it's a little bit true. But anyway, a quick search later revealed that the song was most likely by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, and it wasn't long before I picked up this CD here. Because sure enough, "Do You Love Me" was the lead-off song. And I didn't know what I was getting into here, folks. I never heard Nick's previous band, The Birthday Party. Although I would later find that the Birthday Party inspired bands like the Jesus Lizard, which I was familiar with. But that's okay because the Birthday Party were on a completely different tip than the Bad Seeds. It's kind of the same situation where I could enjoy Love and Rockets without being an expert in Bauhaus. It kind of didn't matter. It was just a completely different thing. Nick had been on the scene for a long time, but at the time this album came out, he formed the Bad Seeds in 1983. Let Love In was their 8th studio album in 11 years, so they were pretty prolific. I was also aware of Nick as a person since I was reading a lot of Henry Rollins books at this time, which is also a little embarrassing to admit. But Henry is friends with Nick and wrote about him in his journals, which Henry published in books like Get in the Van and the Black Coffee Blues series. And in those books, he depicts Nick as kind of an irrepressible free spirit. I seem to remember one incident at a all-you-can-eat buffet that was pretty funny. But, you know, Nick was portrayed as someone who wasn't necessarily bound by societal norms and behavior or expectations, especially in his youth. So there was definitely a bond between those two guys. And I always kind of wondered if Nick's previous studio album, which was 1992's Henry's Dream, was named for Henry Rollins because of that relationship they had. And strangely, it does have a song on it called I Had a Dream, Joe. And anyone familiar with Henry Rollins probably knows that his best friend, Joe Cole, was tragically murdered in 1991. And I don't know if Nick Cave meant any of that on that album, but it resonated with me. And as I said before, I'm the kind of person who needs a link to something to really be able to get into it. It has to relate to something else I already know, or I find it really hard to approach. And that link to Henry Rollins provided me that link to Nick Cave. That was kind of the front door. And then hearing some of his music on MTV sort of sealed the deal, and I bought this album. So let me talk about first listening to Let Love In. So I liked the little bit of Do You Love Me that I heard on TV, and I bought this disc, and I took it home, and I listened to it, and I was impressed. For one thing, the music had real soul to it. As I said before, it's heavy. This is a pretty heavy listen. It has a lot of emotional weight there. Nick is a very visual writer. Every song is like a movie. I'm going to say this a lot, but this music is very cinematic. The songs have characters, they have settings, they have key events. And as I'm listening, I'm just playing this music like films in my mind. And, you know, people talk a lot about world building these days. You know, the idea that a writer can do what Tolkien or Frank Herbert did, you know, build a cohesive fictional world. Everyone wants to be a world builder these days. Well, that's what Nick Cave has been doing his whole career. The 10 songs on this album seem to exist in the same world. And in my mind, it's kind of a post-apocalyptic Old West dystopia, the kind of place that Cormac McCarthy wrote about in Blood Meridian, or that Stephen King wrote about in The Dark Tower. You know, a kind of place that's ruled by your lower brain functions, but balanced by empty beauty and the possibility of eventual victory or at least redemption. The kind of place where the Old Testament still holds sway, where people have to cope with a vengeful personal God who's just raining down punishment for the smallest offense. So these are the kind of songs I can see being played in a roadhouse in that sort of world by a drunken piano player in the midst of bar fights and just unspeakable things happening upstairs. And if you've read The Dark Tower, you might be familiar with Sheb. He's this piano player that the main character, Roland, encounters throughout his journeys. Sheb and Roland would both feel very at home with the music on this album. And Nick Cave himself struck me as a character in his own world. He's like part crooner, part hellfire preacher, part filthy lowlife. And as he sings, he like inhabits all of these different roles. And he has this blend of the dark and the spiritual that kind of gives him the same sort of weight. And he's punching in the same class as a guy like Johnny Cash. I find them similar, as people who can credibly sing about death and redemption. And in fact, I would say that Let Love In has some similarities to Cash's first album on American Recordings, particularly in songs like Delia's Gone, which is probably one of the darkest songs I've ever heard in my life. And there's only one other person I can think of who could stand in a boat with these guys, and that's probably Michael Gira, who was the leader of Swans. So Gira sings his lyrics like a prophet of doom. He's out there passing judgment on all of us. And if Cave and Gira ever teamed up, we would all be in for it, folks. They'd probably start their own religion with Cave as God and Gira as the devil, or vice versa. And I love me some Swans, and we're surely going to talk about them sometime. They are a fascinating band, but we'll have to stay tuned for that one. Let's talk about this album some more. So I wasn't really a kid when I first listened to this album. I was a young adult, but like I said, it didn't sound like anything else in my collection at the time. I thought the packaging of this record was very interesting. There was a lot there to unpack, as we say now, and a few things struck me, and I'm just going to open this up here, and you see that it has like the clear tray, and if we remove the disc, there's a picture here on the bottom of the tray, and if you look carefully, you can see that it is a picture of the piano at Nick Cave's house or residence, and the room is just covered in paper, and the papers have lyrics written on them in what looks like big block letters, like he wrote it all with a big Sharpie, and a bunch of the papers have big black X's on them with what looks like electrical tape. So this looks like the living room of a madman or a psychopath. So the note on the piano, which is right in the middle, says, it's kind of hard to read here, but it says, "Cleaners or anyone, please do not touch my papers. Leave them as they are. Nick Cave." So this scene alone was enough to convince me that this guy was doing more than just playing a part, the part of a frontman. I mean, he had some issues here, and for him, rock and roll was the only way to address those issues. And he's not doing this because he wants to necessarily, but because he probably has to. The other thing I noticed was on the back cover, Nick was kind enough to include a portrait of the band, the Bad Seeds as they were in 1994. So here we have Mick Harvey on guitar, Martin P. Casey on bass, Blixa Bargeld on guitar. On keys, we have Conway Savage and drummer Thomas Wilder. Now, I had heard of only one of these guys at this point when I had picked up this CD, and that was Blixa Bargeld. And I thought to myself, isn't this guy the lead singer of the notorious German industrial noise band Einstürzen Neubauten? In fact, he was. He co-founded that band in 1980, and it turns out he also co-founded the Bad Seeds in 1983. So I was impressed. Here's a guy who knew how to get around, and I guess his appearance here surprised me, since 20-something me wasn't hugely familiar with Neubauten, but I had heard enough of it to put them in the banging on pots and pans while screaming category. I mean, what I knew of them was they were kind of like Kraftwerk, but with no money. So instead of building their own instruments out of computers and electronics, they built them out of scrap metal and power tools. But you had to admit that they were a pretty unique act despite not having deep pockets, and maybe that's why Blixa Bargeld chose his stage name. I knew from KMFDM's Money album that Bargeld was German slang for money, kind of like the English word cash. So I guess that sort of makes Blixa Bargeld the German equivalent to Johnny Cash, right? I don't know. This is just getting weirder and weirder. Anyway, Blixa is on this record playing guitar, usually in a very textural kind of way. So if we crack open this booklet, the rest of this booklet is lyrics and some photos of the band. Just good to have, because I do like to read the lyrics as I listen to Nick Cave's music. There's also a detailed breakdown here in the back of who played what on each track, which is interesting to see. There are also a few other guest musicians on this album, which we'll talk about. The The only other thing I'm really going to comment on about the packaging is this cover photo. And it never really bothered me, but I just want to point out that my wife cannot stand this cover. She said it always looks to her like the title's carved into his chest, and it just grossed her out. And I never saw it that way. I guess my brain just figured the words were printed as an overlay, but yeah, I see her point. I guess they did print the words in a nifty blood color. And you have to admit that Nick Cave as a person has a pretty interesting, unique look. If you haven't seen it yet, be sure to check out his scene with Brad Pitt in the movie Johnny Suede. It's up on YouTube and is really bizarre. I guess they filmed it back before Brad was a big star. Nick's funny in that scene, and I guess those two guys got along well enough that Brad asked Nick to score some of his films, like War Machine, which came out a few years ago. So yeah, funny thing to see them acting together in a scene. Anyway, let's do a quick track by track. Things start off here with Do You Love Me, of course. And that was indeed the song I had heard on The Real World. The full album version was much better than the little snippet that they played on TV. This song pretty much blows me away, particularly the dynamics of the band, how expressive they are, and going from a really kind of dangerous quiet to just a full-on crescendo. The verses here are groovy and kind of stalkerish, though, kind of like someone dragged Michael Jackson's Billie Jean into an albie and just kicked the crap out of it. Has that sort of vibe. Nick's lyrics paint this sort of impressionistic portrait of an obsessive, dangerous love, like something that wasn't good for anyone but happened anyway. And he uses the phrase jingle jangle over and over on this song and throughout the album. And it's kind of just a recurring thing, again with the conceptual continuity. Thank you, Frank Zappa. The chorus comes across as this chant that's as catchy as it is intense, and it's a real contrast to the more laid-back verses. It's just a really cool song and how it's constructed, one that's for sure going to rattle around in your head for days after listening to it. And I should point out that Nick himself not only sings these songs, but he also plays a mean piano and organ, and throughout this album, he's trading those instruments with Conway Savage. The guitar in this song is really interesting. It's really understated. I can generally hear at least two guitar parts in each of these tracks, though it doesn't always sound like guitar. I try to pick out what Blixa is doing and what Mick Harvey is doing. Here, I guess Blixa is playing the delayed atmospheric noise that you hear throughout the verse part, and Mick is playing more of the guitar-like strums. So if my guesses are correct, Blixa focuses more on the texture and the rhythm, while Mick is playing more of the traditional guitar. And I think that is borne out by the interviews I've heard of Nick talking about their two roles in the band. So that's just my guess, and I can kind of hear it on this song. Do You Love Me was the first single from the album, which might explain why MTV picked it up. And again, I just want to say that this is an album I enjoy more while reading along with the lyrics. And that's something that, you know, this record has in common, for me anyway, with The Magnetic Fields or anything else by Stephen Merritt. Part of the pleasure in listening to Nick Cave and Stephen Merritt is in their words and in what they're saying. So there's a lot going on in the lyrics. They're not so abstract. Track 2 slows things down with a swingy ballad called Nobody's Baby Now. This thing is just a treat for the ears. It's probably the least dark track on this album lyrically and sonically. I just want to point out that this album is meticulously produced. You don't get that weird thing you sometimes get on an album where the producer's throwing all these different reverbs on every different part, and it sounds very pasted together. The band here sounds like they're playing in the same room, which they may well have done. I don't know if it's live, but it sounds like it. You put the headphones on, and it's like you're just sitting in the middle of a concert. It's really amazing. Maybe I should talk about the producer here for a bit. Tony Cohen produced this album, and he had a long history with Nick Cave, having produced material from Nick's previous band, The Birthday Party, going all the way back to the point where they were still known as the Boys Next Door. I also want to point out that Many of the earlier Bad Seeds albums before this one were produced or co-produced by our old friend Flood, who seemed to be everywhere in the 80s and 90s, even in Australia. So by all accounts, the Bad Seeds were a tough band to deal with. They were chaotic in the studio. They had a tendency to play everything live as a band, which messed with the sound separation. So it was kind of the producer's job to wrangle all this and capture lightning in a bottle, which Tony Cohen definitely managed to do on this album. The sound is just pristine, even more so on Nobody's Baby Now. Just a beautiful recording. And that goes into track 3, which is Lover Man. This is like a brooding burner. It has this fairly slow verse that kind of prowls along, lots of creepy background vocals. Then it just explodes in the chorus. It's a really intense song. It's the second single from the album, and it caught the attention of the public at large, maybe because it was covered by Metallica on Garage Inc. and then by Martin L. Gore on his Counterfeit 2 EP. So it's a, artistically acclaimed song. And it's a real burner live. There are some great videos of Nick and the band doing this on YouTube Live. Definitely check that out. Track 4 is Jangling Jack. Again with the jangling, a recurring theme. This is like a noisy punk tune. It's kind of the band at their drunken, disorderly best. The whole song is like, that point in the night where the neighbors are about to call the cops. It's like riding the ragged edge of going off the rails. Nick is just belting out the lyrics in this sort of offhand way. Some story about a guy going to a bar and just getting killed. It's just senseless violence. And the whole time the guy is singing a little song in his head like do-do-do-do, like nothing really matters. So this is a tune about nihilism. It's about as dark as you could want. So if we all came to this album for one song and one song only, it has got to be the next one, track 5. This song is like an entire novel in just 6 minutes. It's a masterpiece in both sound and story. It's the third and final single from this album. It received a lot of attention. It's still receiving a lot of attention. It's been used in dozens of films and TV shows. The Scream movies, Hellboy, The X-Files, recently in Peaky Blinders, to name a few. It was covered by a lot of different artists, including Arctic Monkeys, Iggy Pop, and Snoop Dogg. It's one of Nick Cave's signature tunes, and there's a chance that if you know just one Nick Cave song other than the Mercy Seat, it's this one. And of course, I'm talking about Red Right Hand. Now, when I first heard this song, I thought that it could only be about Randall Flagg. And for those who don't know, Flagg is a character in Stephen King's The Stand. He's the embodiment of all evil in the post-apocalyptic United States. He's able to attract other people, evil people, to himself. Spoiler alert. And he quickly organizes them to take over what's left of the world. Now, Flagg's right hand wasn't red, and this song isn't literally about him, but it's about a similar kind of person. Nick uses the image of a red hand to symbolize evil. Legend has it, and by legend, I mean Wikipedia, that the red right hand is a reference to a line in John Milton's poem Paradise Lost. Anyway, when I hear this song, a whole movie plays in my mind. I don't have synesthesia, but it's something like that. Cave paints a very clear picture of places in a town, describing particular scenes. It's easy to see what he sees in your mind's eye. I see a camera panning from left to right across a barren, wasted landscape, looking like something that Sergio Leone might have filmed with a widescreen lens in southern Spain, pretending it was the old American West. Cacti and bleached cattle skulls as far as the eye can see. That's what I see. So, speaking of world building, legend also has it that Cave filled notebooks with maps and details of the town described in this song, little of which wound up in the final song, but some of which may have been based on his hometown of Wangaratta in southern Australia. So there's a lot of detail here packed into very few words, and even more imagination that went into this song than you might realize. So sonically, this song also impresses. It has really cool dynamics, very loud to very soft. Most of the verses are very muted and understated. And there are three really strange and cool features in the music that really make it stand out to me. One is the recurring bell chimes that sound like a blacksmith pounding an anvil after Nick says the words red right hand. And there's a theremin-like oscillator of some kind that Nick starts playing around halfway through, I think after the second chorus. And then there's the timpani that Thomas Wilder is playing. It adds so much. It's like thunder in this song. And it really, all these things build up the tension in the chorus part, which isn't really like a normal chorus in a song, but it kind of fills that role. And Nick also plays two really nifty organ solos in there. In fact, I'd go so far to say this song is so cinematic that I'm surprised someone hasn't made a film about it yet. Not a film that uses the song, because that's been done, but a film inspired by the song. That's how complete an idea this is. They did make an official video for it, but I think the video is pretty abstract. It's mostly Nick singing the song with the other guys walking around in a house where some family lives. And, sure, it's got brief shots of shotgun shells and cutting up raw meat, like most videos from 1994. But to me, it just doesn't really convey as much as the imagery of the song itself. Maybe that's just me. Anyway, a classic song, Red Right Hand. Give it a spin if you haven't heard it in a while. Then we reluctantly go to track 6, I Let Love In, which is almost a title track. This is another swingy mid-tempo tune. The thing that stands out here for me is Conway Savage's piano riffing. It's just amazing. Great lyrics, great vocal delivery, another cool song. Track 7 is Thirsty Dog, which is another fast, loud tune, almost rockabilly. Evidently, the Thirsty Dog is a bar where the narrator is feeling very apologetic. Listen to the song to see why that's funny. But I do like this song, but I really can't think of anything more to say about it. But I have a lot to say about the next song, Ain't Gonna Rain Anymore. It's just a beautiful, dark, atmospheric ballad. It's either a breakup song or maybe a eulogy. I can't figure out which. The tune has some string parts that you'd be forgiven for thinking were just some synth pads. But no, those are actual violins, one of which is played by Warren Ellis, who would soon become a Bad Seed in his own right. This was Warren's first appearance on a Bad Seeds album, if I'm not mistaken. But I do love this song. Again, it's so cinematic, and I keep saying that word, but it's true. And you know how you can go into a movie theater and watch a movie at like 100 decibels, so it's really loud, and whatever music they're throwing on a scene, it just makes it hit so much harder. Somehow tying the music to the movie and vice versa, it just dials up that emotional impact, at least for me. I mean, am I alone here? That's kind of the response I have in the movie theater. And it's greater in an actual theater where the volume is so much louder than if I'm just watching a movie at home. But that's the feeling I get listening to Ain't Gonna Rain Anymore. Except there is no movie. It's just the song. There's so much emotion packed into the words, the vocals, the band's playing. I really love the transitions from the chorus back into the verse, how it suddenly gets so quiet, and the way he sings the word gone on the first beat of the verse. Like all the light just gets sucked right out of the music, and it's a great little detail in the arrangement here. I just love this song. And then we have the penultimate track, Lay Me Low. In case you were thinking that Nick Cave and the band took themselves a little too seriously, this song is a breather. It's just a little bit silly, not in a laugh out loud way, but in a kind of dry, restrained kind of way. The premise is that the narrator is describing his own funeral, which grows to epic proportions as the song goes on. His self-image is just inflating like Violet Beauregard. This song did make me look up what a flugelhorn was, so, I learned something. This was educational. But it was a pretty funny tune, and if you needed something to distinguish the work of Nick Cave from the work of Swans, rest assured that Swans would never record a song like this. finally, we round things out with Do You Love Me Part 2. This is like a slower, darker twin of the opening track. A reprise of sorts, but with these creepy porno theater vibes, like something's going on there that shouldn't be going on. And you can notice details like the references to bracelets on the wrists and ankles. So in the original song, they refer to actual bracelets the woman was wearing. But in this song, they refer to black and blue marks. So really creepy song. There are these detuned strings of some sort throughout the whole thing, which make it pretty unsettling. And the lyrics make it positively disturbing. And the doo-doo-doos throughout this song echo the doo-doo-doos from Jangling Jack. And of course, we have more references to jingle jangling in the lyrics. It's just a great way to end the album in case Lay Me Low left you smiling too much. This one will definitely wipe away that smile for sure. But there you go. That's the album, 10 tracks, plus a handful of B-sides and the singles, which I have to admit, I haven't heard. Why do I love this? Again, it's just so different stylistically from about anything else in my collection. I love the post-apocalyptic juke joint kind of feel here, closing my eyes and letting these songs play out in my head. Nick Cave has a way with words, so maybe it isn't surprising that he's also a novelist. He published a book called King Ink on Henry Rollins' 21361. That one was mostly poems and lyrics, but he published his first novel, And the Ass Saw the Angel, in 1989. And a second novel called The Death of Bunny Monroe 20 years after that. And I haven't read these yet, but will likely pick them up. In short, Nick is just a talented guy. His voice, his vision, his band, the stories he's able to tell with his songs, the moods they can strike. No one else hits quite like Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, and that's why I love them. So where are they now? Well, they're still at it. The band's lineup has changed a lot over the years. Martin P. Casey and Thomas Wilder are still Nick's rhythm section, but there are 3 other guys in the band now. Warren Ellis, who played the violin here, is now the band's guitarist and multi-instrumentalist, as well as one of Nick's closest musical collaborators. They did a solo project together during COVID, an album called Carnage, which was critically acclaimed. The Bad Seeds last toured in 2022, and there's nothing to suggest they won't continue to tour and make music. So far, they have a whopping 17 studio albums, a very impressive discography, plenty of success in their career, plenty of critical acclaim. Time will tell if they do more. And there you have it, folks. The epic album Let Love In by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. Coming to a bad dream near you, perhaps, or maybe a good dream. What's the difference, really? If you're dreaming at all, that means you're doing pretty well. Things could always be worse. Take it from me, another old guy. You're listening to Stronger Than Reason, either on YouTube or as an Apple or Spotify podcast. And if you're listening some other way, something fishy is going on. What the hell? So you might notice that this is episode 39. You see, obsessively numbering everything makes me feel good that I'm making some kind of progress in my life. But that means that the big 40 is coming up. So to celebrate 40 episodes, I'm thinking that the next one might be a bit different. So you might want to brace yourself for that. In the meantime, I thank you for listening, and until next time, stay strong.